Hello everyone. So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about ARIA, the standard for accessibility-rich internet applications. We'll talk about why we should care about ARIA, and also investigate a few simple tips that we can keep in mind as we're building our websites to make sure that they are working for the greatest number of users. We'll investigate a couple ARIA attributes and see how ARIA is used by tools like screen readers to adjust the way our website is presented to people with disabilities. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about why we should care about ARIA. So hopefully it's enough of a justification for you that the internet is built on the idea of open access for everyone to all information. So hopefully that by itself is justification for you to make sure your website works, even for people who have different mobility or sightedness. If that's not enough of a justification for you, then another big reason is that it is actually the law, and if you don't follow it, you can be subject to some pretty expensive penalties. Even just in the year 2023, there had been over 400 different lawsuits of people suing a website because it didn't meet the legislative requirements for having a website be accessible. This is sort of like the digital equivalent to not putting a wheelchair ramp on your website, and you don't want to run afoul of that. That can be a very costly mistake to make if you're designing a commercial website for a business. So with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about what ARIA is. So ARIA is a set of standards for actually implementing these accessibility features. It's not an individual tag, it's not a particular attribute on things that you just attach. It's more a broad set of strategies. And in fact, those strategies tend to prefer basic web technologies if you're using the rest of your HTML and CSS in a very standards compliant way. You're already halfway to building accessible websites. So when we say accessible websites, we're referring to several different things. There is a huge range of disabilities out there, and each has its own particular impacts on the way websites are browsed by our users. So one of the simplest checks we can do is try out some of these tools. Obviously, without the knowledge to actually read Braille, without the specialized hardware that we would use for that, some of these tools are out of our grasp. But there actually are tools that you can even use right now as you are designing your websites. One that I always like to point out to my students is the screen reader plugins that are available for browsers. So most of my students end up using Chrome. If you're on Chrome, this screen reader plugin here, you can install it and use the keyboard shortcuts that they bring you through in a tutorial, and you can actually hear how someone would interact with your website if they're unable to actually view the text. So I do strongly recommend you do try this at some point. I used to run through a tutorial with my students live in class where we would try to navigate a couple common websites. I'm not going to bother you guys going through that myself, but like I said, I really do strongly recommend you try it on your own because it is a very valuable experience to see how, or rather hear how people have to interact with websites if they don't have the same capabilities as the average user. In terms of what we can do on our websites to make them easier for screen readers, I kind of have 5 simple rules that I like to suggest. Rule number 1 is make sure you are using meaningful semantic HTML tags. As I said before, using HTML tags properly, the way that they were designed with the meanings that they carry, is going to help these screen reading technologies a ton. Even if it's not a screen reader per se, if it's some type of clicking mobility assistant, if it's some type of program that parses and summarizes information, if you're using tags the way that they were designed and what they were meant for, those technologies are built with those uses in mind, so they're going to have a much, much easier time parsing your website. If you instead decide to use the nav tag to describe the header of your text and you use the article tag to have a bunch of links over on the side, that's often going to trip these programs up because they might even be hard-coded to look for certain tags like the main content area or the article text to identify which things should be read first or which should be emphasized. So that's rule number 1, is use the correct tags. Rule number 2 is, at the very least, don't use tags in a way that contradicts the correct use. So this is sort of a corollary to the first rule, which is if you are using things correctly, the assistive technologies are going to have a much easier time parsing them. If you use them explicitly the way that they were not designed to work, if you are changing a lot of block elements to inline and inline to block and applying really weird absolute positioning to make some invisible, all of that is almost certain to trip up these types of tools. If you are taking things in particular that are non-interactable and making them your primary means of interaction, or taking things that are generally interactable and making them non-interactable, this would be something like having a bunch of invisible checkboxes that someone can't click and that they can't click anything related to them, but they're doing stuff behind the scenes on your website. That might be a really powerful tool for getting your website designed as you want, but it may not be a very accessible choice because these assistive technologies are designed to assume something like a checkbox is something that a user can click. So even if you've styled this thing to be invisible to the eye, these assistive technologies won't pick up on that, and they'll still be reading off this list of invisible checkboxes to their user one after the next. So in particular, crossing that interactable, non-interactable barrier, that is a big no for accessibility. Which actually brings us to our third point. If you are designing your website, make sure that you do not trap focus when you're navigating without a mouse. So what I mean by that is not everyone has the ability to use a mouse. We kind of take for granted that on our website we can click around, we can precisely pinpoint things that we want to move to. We can click into input fields. We can click on very tiny little options. The reality is a lot of people don't have use of the fine motor skills required to do that. And so instead, there are many, many users that will primarily navigate your website using the keyboard. So tools like screen readers have their own keyboard navigation built in. But even if you're not using one, there is a way to navigate websites using just the tab key. Every time you press the tab key, it will move you to the next interactable control. When you hold Shift and click Tab, it will bring you back to the previous control. So that is another thing to keep in mind, that when you are designing these websites, you do want to make sure that if you are tapping Tab through your website, for instance, you don't end up stuck somewhere, say on a input field that if it validates to false, it re-highlights. If you do that, someone could end up tabbed and stuck in a control that they can never escape from. You want to make sure that when you are navigating the site, you're moving in a sane order and that you're never getting stuck anywhere along the way. So the final tip is make sure, especially controls, but every part of your website is meaningfully labeled. So what I mean by that is Anytime you have something that is presenting information non-textually, say a large image, say a date pick selector, say a number spinner or an input box, all of those controls need to have some textual description of what they're doing. This is even a great tip if you are just designing a website generally. If you've got an image and you've got a large image somewhere on your website, what you're going to want to do is have some fallback text. Let's say I've got this labels PNG, but I accidentally put that image on a path where it doesn't exist. If I use the alt attribute on my image, I say, well, when the image can't load, then instead display this line of text. And you can see labels PNG doesn't exist. So on my actual website here, I've ended up with that line of text. So that's a benefit for me already. But as we said, our very first ARIA rule is if you use this correctly, you've already also gained some accessibility, because someone who can't even see your image, a screen reader will be able to read them out a description of what that image entails. So this is one very powerful little trick, and it applies not just to images, but as we said, to all of our controls. There are also ARIA attributes that sort of fill this same role when we don't have a direct attribute as we do on image. You can describe an ARIA label, as we'll see in just a minute. So do make sure you are making use of these features, because it can make sure that someone actually gets some readout of what your thing is, even if they can't see it themselves. So now I want to talk about a couple other quick little tricks or considerations when you are designing your website. So the first one is, if you are designing your website, make sure that your descriptions of things are actually meaningful. So the big one that always trips people up is I see a lot of people design things like links or buttons, assuming that people can see visually what they are near, or in context of a sentence, what a button or a link is for. A lot of the times people use text like "click me" on their link to say, hey, go and click on this link. That is actually one of the least accessible descriptions you can put on a link. It would almost be better just to have the full HTTP URL right in there. The reason why is because if I am using a screen reader and I'm rapidly tabbing through my page, eventually it's going to get to the link. It's going to say a link titled "click me." And it's not going to read the whole preceding sentence. It's not going to contextualize that thing. When your only mode of interacting with a website is your ears, time is sort of at a premium, and it tries to condense things down as much as it can as it's reading text out to you. It's also reading at miles a minute. It's very, very quick text. So if you use a short, nondescript label, assuming that someone will be able to tell based on where it is, someone using assistive technology may not have that context any longer. It may be that when they tab to the link, they have no clue what this thing is when it just says "click me." And as I said, one trick you can do here is using the ARIA label attribute to specify what the label should be for a text reader. But even better than that is making sure that when you actually pick the text for all your users, you describe exactly what that link or button or interactable control is supposed to do. So that's one trick. Another trick is judicious use of ARIA Roles. So ARIA Roles is a system that allows us to override the way that a control normally works when we are loading up and interpreting an element on our web page. So by default, different controls read out differently with assistive technology. If we're using something like a screen reader and I approach an input by default, it's going to tell me a text input that is labeled whatever it's labeled as. Sometimes we do sort of break the rules a little bit. We've already seen in a past video using an unordered list to talk about navigation elements. That is a semantic use of unordered list, but we probably don't want a screen reader to read out an unordered list listing the options and then each one of our links. When you've got a situation like that where you want to slightly override the default assumptions, you can use Aria Roles. So these roles allow you to specify just with an attribute the Aria role equals, and then one of these different types of applications for tags on a page. In particular, if we use the presentation or none role, that will completely skip that element. So one trick that you can experiment with is if you hide something visually with CSS, if you're setting its width to 0, or its opacity to 0, or its display to none, or its visibility to hidden, you may also want to be setting a presentation or none Aria role on it. Because otherwise, we're going to run into that situation we were talking about before, where you've got 12 invisible checkboxes that are pulling all the strings of your website, and suddenly someone's tabbing through and they hear about all these checkboxes and they assume they're in a form, when really you were just using them for fancy styling. So role manipulation is a very powerful tool for allowing us to change the way that controls that already exist do get read out when we're using assistive tech. As I said, the first rule of Aria is try to use your tags correctly. If you're using your tags correctly, there's no need for this role at all. But if you can't do this and you can't do two, at the very, very least, you can update the role so that it matches the way that you are using the thing. So we already mentioned Aria label and Aria labeled by. There actually is another way that we can also write labels. If we're using something like a input field, it is also possible to write a label as a separate attribute. And this is, again, sort of our goal with Aria is always to use default web tech and not use the Aria specific attributes when we can get away with it. If I write a label as a separate tag, directly adjacent to whatever it is I'm labeling, whether it's an image and a caption, whether it is a input field and a text description. First, a screen reader is already generally going to be smart enough to pick up that that label is for that input, but we can even go one step further and say, my label is for some other ID. And then if we use that ID to talk about that control, then this text will get read out in association with this input control. And that helps make sure that you don't have any bare controls like we had talked about with the click me button or the click me links. So the one last thing that I do want to mention is tab order. So we had mentioned that a lot of people will be browsing your website with a keyboard. There is actually an attribute you can put on any element called tab index. If we set a tab index, we actually say this is the order that you should navigate to each one of these elements. And when you press tab, it'll first go to the 1th element, then the 2nd, then the 3rd, then the 4th, then the 5th, going up until you run out of elements, and then it will tab through any default ones that you didn't set, and then eventually go back to the beginning again. So tab index is really, really valuable, in particular, if you're working with grids or other layout types, like we discussed back in our positioning video, that might cause things earlier in your document to appear lower down on the page. The biggest enemy of tab-based browsing is when things are positioned and you're pressing tab and you're up here and suddenly you jump to the bottom, then you jump up back up to the middle, and then you're up a little bit more and then you're down to. If you're tabbing like that, it becomes very, very difficult to keep track of where things are and what's going on the page. If you do have to use a layout like a grid to get the effect you want, and you're using these grid areas, it can be really, really valuable to set tab index manually to make sure that someone visually is still going top to bottom on your web page, or that they're navigating through elements in an order that makes logical sense. Maybe all of the things related to a form back to back, and then all of the site nav elements back to back. You want to try to logically group these things so that when someone is browsing through, they understand what is going on. If someone is using assistive technology, there is a slightly more sophisticated version of tab index that may also apply to them, and that is the Aria-Flowto attribute. If you set the Aria-Flowto attribute on one of your controls, then you can specify an ID of another tag, and when someone's using something like a screen reader, as they press the next button to go through their navigation of the site, Aria-Flowto will tell them, go immediately to this next element. This can be really, really valuable for things like sections that aren't interactable controls. Normally, something like a header or a paragraph won't steal tab focus with a tab index. However, with Aria-Flowto, we can still say, oh, well, you know, the main article of my web page is right here, so flow from the nav bar to the header, flow from the header to the first paragraph, flow from the first paragraph to the next, eventually down to the comment section. Aria-Flowto allows us to make sure that, again, even if our website appears out of order in our HTML, someone who is having the site read out to them is hearing it read out in an order that makes sense, that won't get them lost. And they will understand when they are flowing to navigation or to an interactable control. So this was an overview of just a few different tricks that we can use. So these 5 rules of Aria give us just a couple rules we can use to make our websites more accessible. Much like our responsive design, they allow us to make sure that no matter who our user is, no matter what situation they're in, they're able to get something out of our website and still browse it just as effectively. This is just barely scratching the surface of this topic. I really do recommend you go explore this, look up videos of people actually using these technologies, go see what's out there, because there is a ton happening in this space and it is constantly evolving. Hopefully, you already are inspired to think about some ways you could be using these technologies in your own websites. So I look forward to seeing that, and I will catch you all in the next video.